good morning. Welcome Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza to the Elephant for a Conversation. Professor Zeleza is Vice Chancellor of the United States International University here in Kenya, originally from Malawi, but he's also Kenyan. He's a citizen of Africa. He's one of our most accomplished African intellectuals. He's a historian and a prolific and insightful commentator. I remember during the 2007-2008 crisis that we had in Kenya after the elections, your blog, Prof, was one of the first stops for everyone who wanted to understand what was actually happening, the political forces that were happening. So thank you for all your great work. Welcome, Prof. I just wanted to ask, how are you doing?
So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. Of course, I'm a great admirer of your work in the Elephant. It's truly a pleasure for me to talk to you. In terms of how I'm doing, both personally and professionally, personally, I'm doing fine, and my family is well. As for the university, we are, like many universities, we are also doing our best. The pandemic, of course, started earlier this year, and in March, all the education institutions in the country were closed. And like all of them, we closed on the 17th of March, but we were able to make a transition to online delivery. This May, we started our new semester, also online, including conducting orientation for new students and their parents, but we can talk a little bit more about that later.
Very glad to hear that. Prof, let me just launch into discussion with a question you have been thinking about and have written about. For your reflections on the political economy of this coronavirus pathogen.
Yes, a pandemic of this magnitude, like any crisis, what it does is it reveals the structural and systemic fault lines in society, as well as, of course, in the global arena, in the world system. And in this particular case, what we are seeing, obviously, is that we are seeing the hierarchies of power, both internally within societies as well as among societies, being revealed in terms of the inequalities. The notion that is an equalizer is not true, yes. Because obviously the poor and in the global north, people of color, are suffering disproportionately from the crisis. So it reveals social inequities quite glaringly. And then, of course, it also reveals the capacities of governments as well as the public space to deal with those crises. And we are seeing different capacities to deal with that. For example, the United States, the world's richest country, has demonstrated its total incapability to deal with a crisis. Of course, that shows you the challenges it has had in terms of its healthcare system, the challenges it has had in terms of upward mobility of wealth from the middle classes to the rich people. So all those class issues, all those racial issues, the gender issues, the issues about migration, they are exposed in terms of capabilities of governments to deal with them. And then, of course, as a result of that, you're beginning to find, the old ideological frame in which, the right wing, for example, the so-called Washington Consensus, was interested in the state getting out of society, diminishing the state. It demonstrates that, in fact, the state is important. And you're finding governments like, the British government and other governments in the Western world, including our own governments in Africa, beginning to, intervene in terms of stimulation packages, in terms of mitigation measures that bring back the state, which is a reversal of an ideological regime that has been rampant for the last 30, 40 years. So it shifts ideological discourse within countries and globally. And of course, it also shifts global hegemonic rivalries. We are seeing the United States, for example, and China competing on who is best able to handle the crisis. And of course, within that, the whole debate about who caused the crisis, and the US acting almost like a petulant child and saying, China, the WHO, and all that, you're responsible for this, trying to camouflage its own incapacity to deal with that. So it is feeding into superpower rivalries, which of course were already there and heating up. So in short, a crisis of this magnitude reveals a lot of systemic, social, structural, class, racial dynamics and inequalities. And at the same time, it's also provoking struggles social struggles for change, for transformation. A lot of governments in the world will not be the same after this crisis compared to what they were before.
Really, since the 1980s, across Africa, we have implemented policies that were based on persuasion that government was seen as bad, inefficient, corrupt, and the less government you have, the better that the market and private sector can solve society's grand issues. But as you said, we've seen in the West sort of a reversal within the countries that were the primary proponents of this ideological position. How does Africa sort of reimagine its own alternatives in terms of policy?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The neoliberal consensus, which of course came on board from the turn of the 1980s, with the coming to power of governments like those of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, Brian Mulroney in Canada, and so on and so forth, was really a reversal of what had been then the consensus, a kind of consensus, the Keynesian consensus, which had emerged as a way of resolving previous crises, namely the Great Depression of the 1930s, in which the role of the state was seen as important. And then, of course, this backlash against that, coming out of very complicated forces in the 1960s and 1970s, is the one that has been, running, basically the world economies since then. Now, the beginning of the collapse of that Washington consensus, of the neoliberal hegemony, really began with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. In which it was quite evident that the kind of hyper-capitalism that had been introduced had led to enormous inequalities in society, and it was also leading, obviously, to anger, which was giving rise to populist governments, led, ironically, by some of the fractions of the very rich people who have no clue what the ordinary people go through. Somebody like Trump, no clue. Somebody like Farage in Britain has no clue what the ordinary people really do, but they were able to mobilize that anger, and turn it into political capital that they used to seize power and, of course, to continue pursuing the agenda of the neoliberal agenda. But the ideological hegemony of that neoliberal agenda was already under challenge during that, Great Recession. What has happened with the coronavirus, I think these are the last nails in the coffin of neoliberalism. It doesn't mean that it will not continue to fight. And as you say, there are still elements, very powerful elements, whether we are talking about our own countries or we are talking about other countries, that are still wedded to elements of that neoliberal agenda because it promotes their interests. However, for Africa, what has become quite evident is that our rich people who had neglected, because of the neoliberal agenda, neglected the building of social institutions, of the social sectors, health, public health, education, and so on. For example, in education, we know that a lot of our rich people do not send their kids to our local universities, even if they themselves were educated in those universities initially in the 60s and 70s and even maybe in the 1980s. Instead, they send their kids to Europe, to North America, to Australia, and so on, and parts of Asia now. And then it's the same thing. When they get sick, the first thing is they fly to India, or they fly to Britain, or they will fly to South Africa if they want to be closer to home. Now, because of COVID-19, they can't even travel.
No.
They can't even fly out.
No.
So this has reinforced the need that their own health, depends on building and maintaining and sustaining good healthcare systems, not necessarily for the poor people, but for their own health. And this, I think, ideologically will bring in a different understanding, a different perspective on why it is important to build and to sustain strong sectors, social sectors in our economies, because their own well-being, their own health depends on doing that. Of course, once things are reopened, that memory of the fact that they couldn't travel during this period might just linger sufficiently for them to change their perspectives on how, why, and the importance of building and sustaining local social sectors that are strong, that can deliver the best. And of course, there'll still be class differences, but they may invest a little more because they can't fly out if they get sick right now.
You mentioned, Prof, that this pandemic is accelerating hegemonic shifts that were already underway. And of course, there's been a huge amount of debate about China and China's role in terms of its relationship with Africa. And I'll be very keen for your reflections on that. I interviewed Professor Larry Diamond of Stanford University early on in this series, and he made an interesting and I think truthful point that even for them in the US. China is not just the rising power; it is now the risen power. It is truly a world power, and our relationship with China as Africans, it's not new. The Chinese. You're a historian, so everyone talks as if China is new. It's arrived at the other table. China was here long before Vasco da Gama came with his.
Yes, that's right.
So I'll be very keen on your reflections on how these hegemonic shifts will affect us, but also how we can take advantage of them as Africans.
Right.
How we can position ourselves to.
Yeah, that's very good. I think when you look at hegemonic shifts, they happen very rarely. Over the last 200 years, I think there have been 3 major hegemonic shifts. And they always, ironically, occur during a moment of global crisis,
yes.
Or are accelerated during a moment of global crisis.
Yes.
The first one was towards the end of the 19th century, in which, of course, the rise of Germany
yes.
Was contesting the supremacy of Britain as the first industrial power in history, and that occurred between the 1870s and the 1890s, which is called the era of the new imperialism.
Yes.
At the same time that those hegemonic shifts were taking place, and those rivalries were heating up, Africa and parts of Asia paid a huge price, and that was the price of colonization. Imperialism led to colonization of Africa. The second hegemonic shift that was significant over the last 200 years occurred, started taking place from the 1930s, and of course crystallized during the Second World War, with the rise of the 2 new superpowers, the former Soviet Union and the United States, each of course with their own alliances, the Warsaw Pact, the NATO, the Western, the Eastern, and so on and so on, the socialist world, the capitalist world, and so on. Now, during that crisis, that gave the colonized parts of the world space for them to fight and win their struggles for independence. In other words, decolonization occurred during this very important hegemonic shift in history. Because what happens during hegemonic shifts is that the people, the powers that were there in control no longer have the same controls, and the struggles that the people who were in the societies or in the countries that were under some kind of control, have now the space not only to accelerate their struggles, but for those struggles to reach a certain resolution. Temporarily, of course, all historical resolutions are temporary. And in our case, it led to decolonization. So the question is, what is this transition we're experiencing since the turn of this century, namely the decline of US power globally and the rise of China, which is part of a much larger story about the rise of the so-called emerging economies, or what some people call the rise of the rest. What does that mean for Africa? And for me, the question has to be that we as a people, we as a continent, we as countries on this continent must use this moment in order to achieve some of our historic agendas. And that historic agenda is, frankly, about development, about creating integrated, innovative, inclusive, sustainable, developmental, and democratic states. Now, that brings the question of China and Africa. As you rightly indicated, that relationship is very, very old. It goes beyond, Columbus, or Vasco da Gama coming to the East African coast. Yes. Now, in more modern times, of course, that relationship has gone through phases. After the Communist Revolution in China in 1949, you find, of course, China became one of the strongest supporters, together with India and others, for Africa's decolonization. And Chou Enlai, you remember his visit not pleased the Americans and the Western powers because they were, of course, seeing that as opening Africa to powers. The Soviets were already there. Now the communist Chinese are coming.
Thank you, Prof. You are commenting on Africa's long relationship with China and the changes that are taking place now, the hegemonic shifts and the implications and opportunities for Africa.
Yes. So China, after it began its reforms that led it to make the kind of strides that it has made over the last 3 decades, the relationship between China and Africa shifted from revolutionary solidarity more into a business economic relation. And of course, we have seen that in terms of trade, the exponential, explosive growth in trade between Africa and China overtaking the United States, for example, as Africa's biggest trading partner in 2009.
Yes.
For Africa, China is no more a beneficent power for Africa compared to any other power. China is in Africa for its own interests.
Yes.
The question is, what are Africa's own interests in that relationship?
Yes.
And it's important for African states to be very clear about their own interests, because China is pursuing its own economic and hegemonic interests. And for us, we need to be clear what our interests are in that relationship and protect those interests. Now, one of the challenges is the fact that China is one country, 1.2 billion people, dealing with a continent of 1.2, 1.3 billion people split into 55 different countries.
Yes.
That makes it very difficult to have, bilateral relationships for any country that will have the kind of leg to stand on compared to China. So it's important not only for each country in Africa to be clear, but also the regional blocks, East Africa, SADC, ECOWAS, and the Maghreb Union, and so on. But also the continent to have increasingly a common position in dealing with China. And because if we don't do that, China, of course, will continue trying to achieve its interests, some of which obviously are not necessarily about Africa's own interests. So the issue of whether China is an imperialist power, is exploiting Africa, for me at one level is irrelevant. China is in Africa for its own interests. Yeah. The question is, what are our interests?
Yeah. Prof, I mean, one of the concerns that has been expressed by many commentators around this pandemic, and also in a sense accelerated by this deepening relationship with China, which is, as you say, is an old relationship that has been rekindled and has accelerated very quickly, to the point, as you said, in 2009, they are our primary trading partners, Africans. But a range of measures have been implemented to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic, restrictions in movement. We are all working from home, social distancing, etc., etc. And in a number of countries, we've seen the implementation of states of emergency. And there is a concern that this opportunity may be used by elites to draw back gains that have been made on the democratic front. We recently had a rather curious election in Burundi, and and I think we have one coming up in Malawi, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yes.
And obviously these exercises are made much more challenging by the coronavirus, social distancing, and the like. And I was wondering whether you can reflect somewhat on some of the political imperatives to be able to consolidate gains, political in terms of rights, democratic gains that have been made, especially since the 1990s across Africa, and so that this pandemic doesn't become an opportunity for elites to draw back on that and create almost a new authoritarianism out of this moment.
Yeah, every historical moment, and this is true even more so for moments of crisis. First of all, is to realize that they are contradictory moments, they're complex moments, and they're constantly changing. With that, every social group and the elites of Africa, the political classes in Africa, are not different from political classes elsewhere. They would try to use the COVID-19 to their advantage. That one is almost a given. The issue becomes, what are the social movements and the activists, whether you're talking of activist intellectuals, activist civil society organizers, and the whole range of social movements that fought for democratization. To what extent are they ensuring that they maintain and in fact expand the gains that were made up to this point? So this is a moment for social movements to redouble their struggles. And it's a moment to ensure that any clawback, because the elites will try to have clawbacks. You mentioned Burundi recently, and you mentioned Malawi, that is going to elections, where the regime has been trying to use COVID-19 to, of course, consolidate its position. Now, what the social movements have been doing in places like Malawi and some of the activists is to challenge the state in terms of some of the measures for COVID-19, going to court, for example. And you also saw recently, some of the movements and activists in South Africa going to court to challenge some of the measures that the government was imposing. So the point is that you expect the elites to use this moment to consolidate or to regain certain advantages, certain positions that were favorable to them prior to COVID-19. So the challenge is on social movements. The challenge is on activists to ensure that they push back against that, but at the same time also push the envelope even further to ensure that there are more gains during this moment that will be consolidated following COVID-19. So it's a continuous struggle.
Last but not least, Prof, I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on the economic disruption that we've talked a bit about the elites and the political challenges that and opportunities that confront us. But this is proving to be a tremendous economic disruption as well, because this is the most dramatic self-imposed sort of decline in demand in our economies that we've seen for several generations, where people are stuck at home, so they're not purchasing, they're not trading, they're not not traveling, etc. And what does this portend? I've been struck in a number of African countries by the number of urbanites of African cities who have retreated to the rural areas and become farmers and are growing their maize. And I don't know, what does that tell us about ourselves as Africans and the way we want? Because there's a sense in which this pandemic has also demonstrated our our resilience as Africans.
Right.
Because people have responded in a fairly robust way to it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's absolutely true. That the pandemic is disrupting all economies around the world, and of course in some countries differently from others. But we all know that economies are being disrupted severely, and at the same time, what you're finding is, as you rightly said, the development of new forms of resilience, the development of new forms of creativity, the development of new forms of work, of new forms of value that are being created. So again, it's important for us, I think, to obviously, make sure that our societies, our countries mobilize at the state level the kinds of support systems that are necessary for the most affected people in our countries, in the informal sector, in the small and medium enterprises. There needs to be concerted interventions and support for them. At the same time, it's also important for us, particularly those of us who happen to be academics, who happen to be researchers, to begin thinking very seriously, what are the implications of these COVID-19 disruptions in terms of the future of work. What it is doing, it is intensifying or accelerating trends that were already there, namely the digitalization of life, of society, of the economy. And it's also accelerating, in that context, the so-called fourth industrial revolution. So to what extent are our educational institutions, our private sector, our public sectors, our civil society sectors thinking through some of these challenges and some of the transformations that are going to continue following COVID-19? So how do we train our young people? To what extent are we imparting in those young people skills of lifelong learning, skills that will give them resilience, skills that will give them flexibility, skills that will give them the ability to adapt to different contexts? Because we've been training people for very narrow career choices. And as you say, people now realize that, in fact, part of surviving this crisis is by doing things differently, including going back to the rural areas. So, what is going to be the impact of this in terms of urban-rural migrations? It's a question that we need to be asking ourselves. In other words, as you said at the very beginning of this conversation, while much of our focus has been, in terms of research, has been on the biomedical aspects of the epidemiology of COVID-19 and all that, which is, of course, extremely important. What we need to be spending time also is very serious thinking and research on what are the social, political, economic impacts of this COVID-19, and what are the strategies people are developing to deal with it that may, in fact, lead to the reshaping, restructuring of how we live, how we relate with each other, how we work. And these are, I think, important questions. It opens new opportunities, new ways of doing things. And obviously, it's a very painful moment right now. A lot of people are losing their jobs. A lot of people's livelihoods are under threat. At the same time, you are also finding in communities people summoning collective support for each other, new forms of philanthropy, new forms of support, both horizontal and vertical, erupting in our communities. And how do we catalyze those developments and make them part and parcel of how we organize society moving forward?
Thank you, Prof. Can I just close with a question on a subject that you've been very, very profound and prolific on, and sitting where you're sitting as Vice Chancellor of USIU, I think you're perfectly positioned, which is the higher education sector, which was already facing its own major challenges across the African continent. Part of the Washington Consensus came with the defunding of a lot of our educational institutions, the fragmenting of them, as private and public, and how does this affect higher education generally, which was already in crisis, and how do we make the changes so that we're delivering, as you said, right now we train our young people for very narrow career choices, but the world is changing. So you talk to accountants, and there's clearly elements of accounting are going to be made redundant by digitization. Elements of law are going to be made redundant by digitization. How do you respond to multiple challenges?
Thank you, because that's my bread and butter. I have to think about those issues on a daily basis. Yes. I think the COVID-19 has laid bare, revealed 6 types of crisis for African universities. Yes. So the first one is, of course, inequalities. Inequalities, within countries, and inequalities among countries in terms of handling this crisis. So you find that in some countries, some universities, even within countries, are better able to handle it because they are better equipped. They have made investments in IT, in instructional technologies and information technologies, and therefore they were able, like us at USIU, we were able to fairly easily from face-to-face teaching to emergency distance teaching and learning using online platforms. And then the second issue has been that this is going to, in terms of electronic infrastructures, is not just a question of the institution having access or having developed capabilities, but it's also the question of the students. Do they all have access? Because they don't.
No.
Do all your faculty or your support staff have access to the electronic devices? Do they have access to internet? Do they have access to power? Because without power, you're not going to have internet. So these infrastructural issues have been thrown up as serious problems for our universities. And then the third is, of course, financial. You find, as we just said a moment ago, a lot of people are losing their jobs, or their salaries are being cut, and therefore the ability by families to support their children to go to university or to attend education institutions is reduced during this period. And the capacity of our governments to also support universities and other institutions of learning in terms of financial support is also severely constrained. And then, of course, there are instructional delivery challenges. Even if you have the infrastructure, even if you have the devices, our students are trained to learn online. Our faculty trained to teach online, and they are not necessarily. So there is the whole range of issues you have to deal with in terms of instructional delivery capabilities, building those capabilities. And then, of course, there is the issue of internationalization. We all have partnerships with other institutions abroad, study abroad programs. We also get students from abroad, like USIU, 15-16% of our students are international students. Now they can't travel. What does it mean? How do you teach them? How do you engage them? And how do you ensure that you build international relationships in the new environment that are mutually beneficial and that are productive? They are not paternalistic, but they are based on solidarities and mutuality of interest. And then, of course, the final issue is thrown into sharp relief is the research capabilities of African higher education institutions. To what extent are we doing research in the biomedical area that is part and parcel of efforts to find solutions in terms of treatments for COVID-19? And then, of course, the other thing we were talking about a few moments ago, what kind of research are our institutions doing in terms of the socioeconomic, political, ecological impact of COVID-19 on our societies. Some of it positive, some of it negative. People say that you can now see Mount Kenya from Westlands, which you couldn't see before because the pollution has gone down. Now, what does that mean in terms of rethinking the organization of our transportation systems, rethinking the organization of our cities, in terms of walking spaces, in terms of bicycling spaces, and the organization of public transport? All these questions need to be researched on by our investors. So those areas for me have been thrown up as challenges for us, and there are of course solutions for each one of them. So when it comes to the mitigations, when it comes to inequalities, we have to become extremely conscious of developing support systems at a national and regional levels, while working with governments, working with the private sector, working with international and intergovernmental agencies to capacitate all educational institutions to have these capabilities. And that has to be a determined effort by all institutions. It's not good enough for one university to do well when the others are not. It doesn't serve anybody's interest. And then when it comes to the whole question of money, finances, again, to what extent can we mobilize resources from the private sector, from our high net worth individuals to support young people who don't have enough resources? If you take our situation in Kenya, the COOPS program, where all these kids get about 70,000 to go to college, and then 16,000 from HELM, and so on and so forth. Now, that is a flat rate. Can we develop a program that ensures that support for students in terms of state support is earmarked for needy students? Not everybody, for needy students. Because those students are the ones, even if you give them 150,000, is not enough for them. And it's not enough for the university to deliver the education to them. So how can we rethink student aid policies at a national level, and at an institutional level? And also, how can we get our high net worth individuals to become serious players in supporting education? There are these reports about African high net worth individuals. The last report I read, they had, they were about 1.8 or 1.9 trillion dollars. These guys have almost close to the African GDP. How much do they give to higher education or to education? Typically they will support, of course, their relatives, but we need concerted efforts at much higher levels. How much do private sectors in our society support education in terms of scholarships, in terms of research, and so on and so forth? So we need to start thinking about re-engaging in different ways, state support, private sector support, and philanthropic support for education. And then when it comes to internationalization, this may have a silver lining for us. A lot of our rich people, as I said earlier, send their kids abroad.
Yes.
Because they have no faith in their own educational institutions, even if they were trained there, as I said earlier. Now, those kids can no longer travel there. If you look at Africa as a whole, we have about 10.4% of the global market in terms of students studying abroad. We only have 4.2% of other people studying in our countries. So there is a huge gap. Maybe this COVID-19 might help us to start closing that gap by getting more of our own people to study home. So that just like we talked about, our own elites no longer being able to go to England if they have a heart attack or, they've got an accident, to begin using our universities. So, and then at the same time, how can we begin developing much better relationships among African universities in terms of sharing training capabilities, in terms of sharing degree programs, in terms of sharing faculty resources, in terms of facilitating greater mobility for students in terms of their degree. So joint degrees, sandwich programs, and so on and so forth, which I think increasingly will become important as part of educational internationalization, that you don't have to travel abroad, but you can be learning, even using virtual technologies, whereby the same class is being taught in Nairobi and is being taught in Johannesburg, and the two professors are delivering the lecture together. So we need to use this moment to think creatively in terms of strengthening, our educational delivery and raising the quality. And finally, it seems to me that in terms of the so-called fourth industrial revolution, I think we have to be intentional in terms of revisiting our curriculum.
Yes.
People talk of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math.
Yeah.
What we need is STEAM, science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math. Because what we need are young people who are able to think in an interdisciplinary manner, in an interprofessional manner, in a creative way. And in fact, you mentioned accounting. A lot of accounting will become, frankly, no longer as careers, because all that can be done by AI, artificial intelligence. Even law, a lot of this stuff can be done, by all these online firms. What is going to become increasingly important is creativity. Creativity is not going to be taken over by AI, artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And the relationship between humans and machine will be one in which creativity is going to have the upper hand. Routine tasks can be turned into machine work. Creativity won't. And so what we have to do, what we have to ensure is that our curriculum is constantly being reviewed and renewed and transformed to reflect the imperatives of the 21st century. And those imperatives are creativity, their resilience, their adaptability, their flexibility, and their ability to have what I call the 4 eyes of learning, internationalization, to understand the world, how it works, because we're all connected, for better or for worse, to have information literacy. Information is doubling at a frightening rate. IBM predicts that information which used to take hundreds of years to double, very soon it will be doubling every 11 hours. So information literacy is going to be imperative. And then, of course, there is interdisciplinary literacy, the ability to understand phenomena, problems, processes from multiple disciplinary angles. And then, of course, you need that intercultural literacy, the ability to work and understand people from different cultural backgrounds. And you need interpersonal literacy, which again, dealing with each other from multiple class backgrounds, gender, religious backgrounds, and all those social markers that make us humans is going to become more imperative. So for me, this is a moment for us to actually rethink education. And it's a very exciting moment.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that profound and hopeful note. Thank you, Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza, Vice Chancellor, USIU. We'll definitely be calling on you again. As you said, things are moving extremely quickly.
Thank you very much. It was truly my pleasure. Thank you very much. Woo!